So there are some statistically significant differences between men and women when it comes to religious experience, religious practices, and we're trying to understand if those are rooted in biology, in sex, or if those are rooted in gender, with how we're raised and conditioned by our environments, our families, by the church.
The Sex Differences Project was the brainchild of Dr. McNamara and Dr. Wesley Wildman, who were working on another project called the Quantifying Religious Experiences Project. One of the preliminary findings was that it seemed as though women had significantly more commonly negative religious experiences. So religious experiences that were valenced with stress or with anxiety or kind of fearful experiences more commonly than the men. And this is just a preliminary finding, but it really got their wheels turning in terms of why this might be.
It's a really complicated conversation where you really do need experts in various scientific fields, talking to experts in sociology and religion, if we're going to be able to tackle these complicated questions.
I myself am a scholar of religion. I specialize in the scientific study of religion, which just means that I use cognitive science, neuroscience, evolutionary biology, etc. to theorize about religion. Then we have Megan DeFranza, who's a Christian theologian. She specializes in the spectrum of gender and sexuality, especially as it's represented in the Christian theological tradition. And Stephanie Arel, who is also a theologian, who looks at critical theory surrounding aspects of shame, trauma, and things like domestic violence. So we've got a broad array of scholars in the core group, and then we collaborate with scholars from other disciplines, departments, and ways of thinking that help kind of shape our project.
That's what's so great about the Institute, is that we can bring scholars who are experts in really diverse fields that don't typically talk to one another, together to find answers to questions that none of them would be able to do on their own.
Currently, we're really entrenched in the finding cross-cultural data using the Human Relations Area Files. And we use the electronic Human Relations Area Files, which is a large database of cultural information, ethnographies, gathered over decades and decades and compiled into a website database.
We are reading ethnographic descriptions of person's observations in a culture, and we're asking specific questions of that and then giving a numerical value to certain things that we find. So, are the shamans all male? 1. Are they male and female? 2. Are they only female? 3. Are they male and female and transgendered? 4. We're trying to slice up that data into numbers that can then be run through statistical analyses.
The busiest and most exciting project that we've got going is the creation of a cross-cultural database of variables ranging from sex differences variables, religious ritual variables, and other cultural phenomena variables such as domestic violence, possession and witchcraft, and religious participation of all sorts, initiation rituals, socio-political rituals. So as we gather these variables, we're able to form hypotheses about the ways in which the different components of culture and sex differences will relate to each other.
We've collected data on 216 different cultures all over the world. We have a sample that stretches into every region of the world. And we've been particularly focusing on marriage residence patterns, meaning matrilocal versus patrilocal. Matrilocal being the husband leaving the husband's family to go live with the wife's family, versus patrilocal societies where the wife leaves her family and goes and lives with the husband's family. And we asked whether those marriage patterns make a difference in the level of participation in religious rituals that men and women exhibit in these cultures.
We looked at the different data that's already been collected on marital residence patterns by different ethnographers and researchers throughout the past couple decades. We were able to come up with coding for each of the 216 different cultures that we've been looking at, marital residence patterns for each of them. So then we looked at the effect that these different patterns have on female religious ritual participation and male religious ritual participation. So in order to find out whether we could actually create a composite variable called male religious ritual participation and female religious ritual participation, what we did was find about 10 to 15 different variables focused on various different things. I just wrote a couple examples up here. Some of them are more obvious and some of them are less. We use what's called principal components analysis to gauge the connectedness, the correlation of these different types of religious ritual participation, to see if we could come up with a composite variable that kind of was able to represent the kind of a ritual solidarity type variable. And if it's a strong enough correlation, then we can go ahead and kind of group them together and create a composite variable.
Our hypothesis was that if women must leave their family of origin to go live with the husband's family, that they would be more likely to utilize religious rituals and techniques to develop a sense of solidarity and group belonging with the new group, which would be very important for things like rearing children and having help from the other women in the society to care for the children.
Sex and gender. These are often confused in our culture, especially because we check certain boxes, whether it's on driver's licenses or forms for our kids to be at the Y, right? Sex refers to biological phenomena. So our chromosomes, our hormone levels, the way our bodies develop, our skeletal structures, genitals, all of these things, and then secondary sex development at puberty that we're familiar with. Gender, on the other hand, is how we live out those differences within a particular culture or religious tradition. So we know that men and women share many similarities, but there are also some differences between men and women. But it's interesting that those differences show up very differently in different cultures. Right, so we have the American Marlboro man who's valued for being the silent, strong type. And then we have my Italian husband and his family who are pretty loquacious. So it's very interesting to see how every culture values and wants to differentiate men and women and talk about how different they are, but they do it in such diverse ways that it really challenges us to ask, what are real differences between men and women beyond the biological differences with which we're more familiar?
In the Sex Differences and Religion Dataset project,
project, we were looking at hundreds of ethnographies in order to cull data that's already been collected by anthropologists and put into resources that researchers can sift. But some of the data is great, some of it's older, some of the questions that were being asked by these ethnographers are questions that are different than what we might ask today, or we would want to ask more questions than what they had. Here's a typical question that ethnographers have asked. Now, what is the sex of the shaman or medicine man in this particular culture? An anthropologist named Martin White coded this data for male and female. But one of the things he didn't ask was, what about persons who are not male or female? There are a number of cultures that recognize more than two sexes in the world. Some recognize as much as 5, or even more. And so what we wanted to say is, what about that question? Is there data within the ethnography that might answer that question, even if it doesn't exist in a current data set? So we went back and culled and looked for evidence of what used to be called hermaphrodites, what we now speak of as intersex persons, as well as transgender. And of course, these words are very different from culture to culture. In a number of Native American cultures, these are two-spirit individuals. So we just use the word 3+ genders, something beyond the binary, to ask, are these individuals recognized in society, and what is their place in the religious structure? So what this allows us to do is to give more nuance to the kind of questions between sex difference and religion than what we've been able to show before.
Well, it really added a whole another layer of variables that we could collect data on, and that Megan was able to understand and interpret the data surrounding intersex variables.
Some cultures may not have hermaphroditic gods or spirits, but they may recognize or tell stories about a hermaphroditic ancestor, and so we reported that data as well.
For those who find place within their culture for these people, a number of them have a hermaphroditic ancestor or a hermaphroditic god, something in the religious perspective that makes space for these human persons in their society. And so I've seen that on a few different levels, but this project is allowing us to ask that question on a much larger level. I've certainly heard people within my evangelical tradition say, oh, the reason we are seeing transgender now is because of feminism and secularization in the West. But what this data shows is that many cultures around the globe, unconnected to one another, unconnected to Western civilization, not secularized, having no trace of feminism in their culture, actually recognize transgender persons in their society. I think that's significant to counteract some of the way certain religious traditions are interpreting the people that they see in the world. One of the challenges of this project is the question of whether the data is accurate, because it's coming to us third hand in many ways. So we have ethnographers going into cultures. Did they see everything that was there? How did they interpret it? Did they even record it? So that's one of the major challenges that we've come up against.
One of the reasons that studying sex differences in this way scientifically is so important is because the research that has been done in the past on sex differences has been very problematic. It's been either bad science or horrible interpretations that has actually contributed to the discrimination against women for various reasons. In fact, much of the science that used to claim to demonstrate sex differences in cognitive ability and in emotionality and things like that has been debunked.
I think many of us who are coding and reading the data are women, and a number of these ethnographers are men, and so they're not even asking some of the kinds of questions that we would love to see answered by this data set. They just wasn't on their radar. These ethnographies are really useful, but they're significantly limited at the same time.
We expect knowledge of sex differences to deepen our understanding about the evolution of religion. Previous theories have often been male-centric, focusing on tribal warfare and hunting. But we suspect these theories don't tell the whole story of how and why religion evolved. So we're considering evolutionary pressures that affect women, such as child-rearing and marriage residence patterns. In addition, the data we've collected reveals important insights about the emergence of female-led spirit possession cults that will help us build computer models of the development of different types of shamanism. As we use our findings to tease apart the classic nature and nurture debate, we expect to get a better hold on how cultures and religions handle and produce sex differences.
Our methodology really seeks to ask those questions in an unbiased way that I am convinced that what we find will not be negative for women. I don't believe that there are any cognitive differences that are going to displace women from certain jobs or anything like that.
In many ways, we're right at the beginning of the study of the science of sex differences, and we're right at the beginning of neuroscience and neurobiology, and so there's really a lot to be explored, and I wouldn't be surprised if we eventually fold transgender folks into the spectrum of different kinds of intersex. But we don't know that yet, so we'll see as we keep studying this.